Okay, welcome to this A-level revision video for Edexcel, Religious Studies, Paper 2, Religion and Ethics, the application of ethical theories to issues of importance. This is video 2 of 7 in 3.2, Sexual Ethics. In this video, we're looking at marriage, absolutism versus relativism, sexual behavior, marriage and the law, Christian approaches to marriage and sex outside of it, scholars like Jack Dominion and Peter Vardy, Islamic approaches, and the Song of Solomon. So this is the exam board specification, and we're covering this bit in red that says sexual relationships inside and outside of marriage, premarital sex, adultery, promiscuity, marriage, contraception, childlessness, and the contributions of Peter Vardy and Jack Dominion at the bottom there. So this is video 2 of 7 videos, and you can see what's coming up next. We're looking at divorce, and we've done an introduction in the last video to sexual ethics. So covering this video in this order, history and nature of marriage, absolute relativism, sexual behavior, marriage, contraception, scholars, Islam, and the Song of Solomon. So some of the key issues that need to be dealt with here that we're kind of grouping together, because there's a lot in this topic, include promiscuity, childlessness, premarital sex, contraception, adultery, and then the very nature of marriage. Is it a sacrament? Is it something that is of sanctity, or is it just a kind of expression of love? So looking at the two positions, absolutism and relativism in terms of ethics in general, this is really, really important. So if you have an absolute approach to ethics, you have a set of fixed moral rules which hold for, in all times and all places. And we can apply this approach to sexual ethics. It might lead us to say that certain acts are always right or wrong. And you find this a lot in conservative religious approaches like the Roman Catholic Church, which tend to be absolutist, stating that certain sexual activities are fundamentally displeasing to God. An example of the absolutist approach to sexual ethics would be natural moral law from the Catholic Church, things like homosexuality and other issues we'll look at. Procreation is the one rule that kind of, in the precepts that prohibits that. Another example would be divine command ethics, found more in Protestant thinking, that the Bible suggests that having children is the purpose of sex, and in Genesis it says the Lord sent man forth to multiply. In contrast, there's quite a lot of relativist approach to ethics. Now, we're not specifically going to look at situation ethics. Well, that could be one, utilitarianism and some of these other theories. Typically, it says there are no fixed moral rules. Principles vary from culture to culture, so they cannot be true in any absolute sense. I think David Hume and his sort of sentimentalist approach to ethics. Ethics are the mores of any given culture, just what people agree on, what they find tasteful and distasteful. Perhaps emotivism is another way of thinking about this. In terms of sexual ethics, this suggests that moral conventions, sex before marriage, just need not apply. Relativists reject the whole idea of sexual morality, emphasizing a liberal or a liberated attitude. So this plays into 3 basic positions that can be taken on sexual behavior. On the right here, we can see Pablo Picasso, who perhaps you could argue has one of these positions in the way that he paints. Look at the bust, the man looking at the woman, and what is that saying about all that we look at? Well, are we just animals? There's a certain animal quality to Picasso's work here. Are we like what the Bloodhound Gang say, you and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals, let's do it like they do it on the Discovery Channel. So are we just complicated animals with all sorts of taboos and rituals that are no more real than anything else? Well, another approach is to say that it's just social interaction. Well, this is a slightly more complicated approach with particularly significant consequences. that as societies we attempt to regulate because of the emotional involvement, because of pregnancy and disease. We call this kind of shallow, like a shallow ecology, a shallow sexual ethic. It's just dead reckoning. It's what we need to do to survive. It's guided by the norms and values of society. David Hume again, in his idea of ethics. And last of all, perhaps the last of all, is the spiritual. The idea of sex as a spiritual act with an ontological significance that goes all the way beyond the feelings or motives of two people involved. So Lewis said sex was nothing but a physical act, a leisure. The idea of leisure sex is a word that's used, and you can think of other terms. Now, this is an ancient history that goes back, perhaps you could argue, to Epicurus, who imagined us, and Lucretius, who imagined us as kind of just little collections of atoms that run around the forest and then bump into other atoms. And it's of no significance. We find this Epicurean morality running all the way through to someone like Kinsey, who we'll see in another video, is one of the modern exponents of completely liberated sex in a way that no morals, an amoral approach to sex, and it's quite radical. So are you an Epicurean? Do you think it's just animal-like? Or the social idea of sex? Well, an interpretation of sex according to social norms and conventions. Well, there's a lot of this around, beginning perhaps with Durkheim, and then through a number of scholars to Foucault today. These are the people who want to observe how the act of sex, the action of sex, is embroiled in social structures, and how it's produced by these social structures. And then lastly, well, the spiritual act of sex, you find both natural moral law, particularly in the Bible, is significant. Now notice number 3 can assume number 2 and number 1, and number 2 can assume number 1. It doesn't negate the other 2. We could be an animal, but an animal that has a soul, has a rational mind. We could be having sex, could have a spiritual nature, but it could also involve social conventions and taboos and rituals even. So it's not a matter of either or, but if you believe in 1, it's usual that you would reject 2 and 3, or if you believe in 2, that you would reject 3. 1 being the most radical view of not many real people today. So a little bit of history and a little bit of law in terms of marriage as a mechanism of regulating sexual activity between individuals. In law, officials may perform a marriage ceremony either as an authorized registrar or as a celebrant. That could be a religious celebrant. Churches are legal places in which you can get married, as are registry offices in the UK. A marriage register is signed by the couple and 2 witnesses and an official, and in a religious wedding that would be the minister. Minimum age in the UK is 16, although you require parental consent. None is required after 18. Until 1837, only the Church of England, Quakers, and Jewish weddings were officially recognised by the state. But then civil marriages were implemented, allowing ministers of other faiths and no faith to conduct weddings. So what then is the purpose of marriage within the law? Well, this is really a sociological question. And the great Catholic sociologist Charles Taylor, in his book The Secular Age, would suggest that marriage is now, in our understanding, is embroiled in our general ideas. In his book The Secular Age, one of the key ideas he develops is the idea of the expressive self, or the buffered self. We now are individuals who express ourselves and seek out our own fulfillment in whatever we do from the individual perspective. Now, what does this do to marriage? Well, marriage then is seen as perhaps as a useful tool by the state to regularize relationships. Maybe it's to protect children, to administer the rights of property. But since people have been living together, or cohabitation is now just thought of as the natural way. It's all about self-expression. Well, that's what sexuality is all about. The moral reasons for marriage may appear obscure and indeed old-fashioned. That highest level, that idea that marriage has an ontological significance, even the question of why get married, even why should we do it as a social action is questioned. So this raises lots of thinking points. Is marriage a way of just controlling sexual behavior? Does it encourage conformity and discourage individualism, so therefore it's bad? Is marriage a way of the state controlling relationships? And how would you answer these questions? From what perspective? So if you think about then the nature of marriage, there's a wide range of views, but roughly they can fall into three types. Let's look at these in turn. The first, you might argue, is the kind of investment approach, the contract approach. It has its roots in the principle of utility or utilitarianism. Marriage is seen as an investment. It appeals to self-interest. We do it because it benefits us in the long term and requires weighing up happiness produced. And you can do that. People who are married in general are happier over their lifetime. They're healthier, they live longer, and so on. You could make that argument. There's a covenant approach, which is a kind of special contract, typically seen before God, that through the marriage vows. And there is therefore a moral duty to keep the covenant. There's a judgment day, after all, for how we do it. This will lead to feelings of guilt and obligation are also involved. At least a kind of Kantian natural moral law and virtue ethics approach. Then lastly, the sacramental approach. Marriage is a kind of spiritual form of transformation that occurs. It can't be reversed or eradicated. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says marriage is an indissoluble union. And Catholic Christianity treats especially marriage as a sacrament. Obviously, the Church of England doesn't do that, since Henry VIII abolished the Catholic Church as the official church of the United Kingdom. So the consequence of this is the Roman Catholic Church doesn't allow divorce. It's literally impossible because marriage is a, quote, indissoluble union. So let's think about this. What are the symbols that might be involved in each of these approaches? What symbols would be approached with the sacramental approach? Well, typically in a Catholic church, you would have the sacrament of Mass or bread and wine to signify that it's an outward sign of an inward blessing. It's not just another promise. What about the covenantal approach? Well, what's the signs of a serious and solemn vow? Well, you can think about the promises made before God, the prayers, the hymns, all of those things that link to aspects of Kantian natural moral law and virtue ethics approaches. What about the investment approach? Well, marriage there, you might argue it's just down to the contract you would sign, the investment approach. So how do Christians then approach marriage? Marriage is an act that is ordained originally. It's an ordinance, a thing, an institution created by God, where men and women make a commitment to an exclusive and binding relationship that will last until death of one of the partners. So marriage is thought of as somewhere where you are faithful. It's typically to one person for life, exclusively. You wear the wedding ring to show that. Typically, it's associated with procreation, certainly in the Catholic Church, and unification, the union of a man and a woman. Jesus didn't marry, and despite what films like the Da Vinci Code suggest, there's no evidence he ever did, but he had a very positive view of marriage. He attended for his first miracle, the wedding of Cana. Jesus had people who were his disciples, who were women, who were married. The Apostle Peter was married. St. Paul is claimed to be notable for his negative view of sex, recommending celibacy. Well, that's one reading of St. Paul. Maybe he's recommending singleness, which is a radical alternative, as we looked at in the last video. So many Christians teach that within marriage there is a natural hierarchy that reflects the relationship of Christ as the groom and the church as the bride. The husband is the head of the wife and must love and honor her as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. In turn, she must love and respect him. Each of you, Paul says, must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Here's this claim that actually what Paul is doing here is undermining patriarchy, establishing a mutual respect. The word love is the word agape, is sacrificial giving to the other. All of this reflects the creation ordinance, reflects what is said in Genesis. A man shall leave his mother and father and be united with his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Right in the beginning, before the fall, it seems marriage happens. And we find in Peter this: wives in the same way be considerate as you live, husbands in the same way be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect. Should be in the text. So just think about this. Does this mean that women are subordinate to men within marriage, or is this about love and sacrifice, not dominion and power? Is true equality ever possible between men and women? What do you think? So there are a range of general attitudes to sex. There is the attitude that certain sexual actions, when we think about premarital and extramarital sex, are wrong because they're unnatural. We find this in the Roman Catholic natural moral law, the divine command ethic approaches to especially homosexuality, but premarital sex and extramarital sex. Aquinas talks about any unnatural use of the genitalia. A second view is that actions that involve objectification are wrong. You find this in some feminist and Kantian approaches to, in particular, pornography. A third approach is that general approach is that sexual activity is moral if it's engaged in by consenting adults. So this would be the contractarian, libertarian approaches to sexual ethics. We would take into account the utilitarian approach of John Stuart Mill's harm principle. And then lastly, the idea that sexual relationships can be used to cultivate virtues and avoid vices, as in virtue ethics. Now think about these things for a second. Does promiscuity, a kind of premarital or extramarital or just a non-marital casual approach to sex, does it encourage illegitimacy, a moral disorder, adultery, and a lack of trust in relationships? Is it ever a good thing to be promiscuous? Ever a good thing just to see sex as a physical act? Can harm and the harm principle be applied to emotional things? So in terms of general Christian attitudes to sex in and out of marriage, Christians see sex as a gift from God, an expression of love and a responsibility within marriage. Sexual relationship reflects that trust, respect, and commitment. Sex is both a unitive and a procreative function, but in Catholicism, the procreation takes primacy. The essential part of sex is for creating a family. The majority of Christians would state that sex outside of marriage, especially involving adultery, and where the definition is really being married and having sex with someone you're not married to, is wrong. But there are some Christians, predominantly Anglicans, who believe that sex depends on the quality of relationship. That sex outside of marriage, for example, in a cohabiting relationship, is permitted so long as there's trust, commitment, respect, and importantly, consent. This would be typical of the Anglican Church, we'll see in a minute. The Bible has, as we've seen in the previous video, has much to say about sex. The Genesis text has been quoted before. For this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father and be united with his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Deuteronomy 22, a woman describes how women were expected to be virgins when they were married. We look at the problems of interpreting some of this in the judicial needed perspective here. Look at the first video. Do not commit adultery is the commandment. seventh commandment in Exodus 20. And it seems to suggest that marriage is the only appropriate context for sexual relationships, ruling out premarital and extramarital sex. So you move to the New Testament, Jesus has surprisingly little to say about sex, mostly because he presumes the Old Testament ethic, Christians argue, because he keeps quoting the Ten Commandments and saying he's not come to abolish them but to fulfill them. Well, he does talk about in a few occasions. In Matthew 19, he quotes the Genesis text, that for this reason a man shall leave his mother and father and unite his wife, and they will be one flesh. The question is this what you might call a creation ethic? One man, one woman for life, exclusive commitment, permanent commitment, and without a get-out clause. He also then says, I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully is as if he's committed adultery. He takes the seventh commandment and he ramps it up. To lust is as bad as adultery. Well, that seems to preclude a lot of sexual thinking as well as action. He assumes the sacredness of marriage. It says in Mark 10, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And therefore, again, the only appropriate context for sexual relations. So we move on to Paul, and we've mentioned him a lot in the last video. Paul includes adulterers in the list of those who will not inherit the kingdom of God. So we have to think about the Christian ethic, particularly as it comes through the Bible. Is it important to limit sex to only after you're married, not before marriage or outside of marriage, or to anyone else who is your spouse? So as we look at the history of church teaching, there's a range of views on sex. I wonder if you know who these people are. Probably you know Augustine and Aquinas, but you probably don't know this third guy. And he's very important in the English-speaking Anglican world. Let's start with Augustine. Augustine says sex was the means through which original sin was transmitted, and sexual desire was seen as a sign of mankind's fallen state, an expression of concupiscence, which is self-centered and lustful desire. Sex is okay on his view if you go down to the marriage bed with sorrow. What a joy killer, as it were. Marriage was seen by him as a way of restricting these tendencies, and it seems responsible to conclude that engaging in premarital and extramarital sex would therefore be examples of indulging in concupiscence. Now, it has to be said about Augustine, he had a pretty wild sex life before he became a Christian, before his conversion. He's known for that. And maybe this is the pendulum swinging too far in his thinking. Well, what about Aquinas? Aquinas puts less emphasis on marriage as the containment for sin. Instead, he extends the theme of natural moral law theory to the territory. He argues that the primary purpose of sex is for procreation of children. The purpose of marriage is to provide the most stable environment to them. You get that from the divine law, not the natural law, that second bit, but they go together. And that children are to be brought up in the faith, is what Catholics would say today. Therefore, he condemned sex outside of marriage, writing in Summa Contra Gentiles that matrimony is natural for man, and promiscuous performance of the sexual act outside of matrimony is contrary to man's good. So it's wrong because it's not good for you. It's not part of your purpose. You won't lead to a flourishing life. So he says for this reason it must be a sin. His third fellow is Harvey Cox. He's an American liberal theologian. He's influenced the Anglican Church, especially in the UK. He's argued that what's important is the relationship of love. Whether the couple are married doesn't matter so much. Cox goes on to suggest that in a world of fluid relationships, extramarital sex is sometimes going to be inevitable. However, he sees it as a symptom that a relationship may have broken down, and would say something like, if love has disappeared, then the love has died, then the marriage has died. And the couple should recognize this in love and charity and move on in divorce. Well, Anglican churches are accepting further of cohabitation, what used to be known as living in sin, provided the relationship is an expression of love and not casual in nature. It can be thought of, some would argue, some bishops would say, is this an excuse or a reason as a step towards marriage? So what do you think? Is Augustine's view biblical, or is it overly solemn and not as joyful as, for example, as we'll see in the end, the Song of Solomon, that celebrates sexual and pleasure perhaps within marriage or not, as some argue? What about Aquinas? Is his view helpful in his understanding that matrimony is natural for man and promiscuous performance of sexual act? It's just not good for you, so don't do it. Is that enough to say? Is it helpful? Maybe it is. And what about Cox, Harvey Cox? Is his liberal Anglican view naive? And is the idea that sex is just an expression of love, will it lead to a chaotic society? You might think of the virtue ethicist Alistair McIntyre, who talks about how emotivism creates chaos. Well, is the modern understanding of sex as merely the expression of what is sort of self-interest or self-expression? Is that creating a chaotic society where children are, and STIs and everything else are the outcome? So, marriage, Christian sex in and out of marriage. What does the church teach? What's Christian theology, as it were, around this stuff? Well, the Roman Catholic Church has a more traditional, no surprise there, church teaching which condemns, and specifically, cohabitation. For example, Pope John Paul II, writing in 1981, argued that such relationships lack commitment and trust and weaken the sense of fidelity inspired by the sacrament of marriage. Marriage can therefore provide the only valid context for sexual relations. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says the sexual act must take place exclusively within marriage. Outside of marriage, it always constitutes grave sin. Well, that's the Catholics. What about the Protestants? Well, fundamentalist Christians, so conservative Protestants, evangelicals perhaps, also take a less liberal approach and believe sexual relations ought not to be undertaken outside of marriage. Many have joined the organization in America, certainly True Love Waits, that's created in 1993. Members take a pledge not to have sexual intercourse until after marriage. However, it may be significant that STD rates amongst those who have made this commitment appear to be the same as those in the general population. These statistics are disputed as to what they mean or how reliable they are. In the UK, an organisation called Romance Academy has encouraged teenagers who may or may not already be sexually active to abstain from sex for a period of 5 months. In the TV documentary No Sex Please for Teenagers, some of those participating reported they felt less taken for granted. There were echoes of Kantian ethics here, a sense that they may have been getting treated as objects or as means. Remember his great maxim, treat people as ends, never as means to ends, to sexual gratification in Kantian terminology, rather than ends in themselves by their partners. So maybe it's not such a bad thing. Moving on then to contraception. What Christians say about contraception, what the Bible says. Well, Genesis instructs the first human beings created to be fruitful and multiply. This suggests that one of the main purposes of human beings is to procreate, and therefore that contraception by implication should be avoided. We get the story in Genesis 4, verse 1, in which Eve gives birth to Cain with the help of the Lord. This could be interpreted meaning that children are produced through God's will. That contraception, therefore, might be seen as possibly something that obstructs the will of God. Genesis 38 tells the story of Onan, according to which he was instructed by his father to sleep with his deceased brother's wife, Tamar, so that she could bear children and preserve the family line. However, he treatedly withdrew before climax and spilled his seed in the ground, as any heir would not be legally considered his. As a result of this, God punished him with death. The story has sometimes been used by Roman Catholics to argue that contraception, avoiding pregnancy, is wrong. Well, is that what the story is about? Or maybe is it more simply that he avoided his duty to produce an heir according to the Jewish codes of conduct or law? Seems to be more of the issue. St. Paul in the New Testament on contraception seems to have favoured, you could argue, celibacy. We thought about, is it celibacy or singleness as a radical alternative sexuality? Now, singleness is arguably a form of contraception, as is celibacy. Paul seems to suggest there's nothing wrong with being single. Some even think he makes it as the ideal state. I wish you were all as I were. Possibly because he expected the second coming of Jesus to happen soon, and therefore thought that Christians should be more focused on spiritual matters rather than sex. Maybe. So what about the church teaching on contraception? What's its theology? Well, the Roman Catholic teaching has consistently argued against the use of artificial contraception, a position reaffirmed by Pope John Paul VI in 1968 in his encyclical Human Vitae, which nevertheless did permit the use of the rhythm method, as well as sexual abstinence as non-artificial forms of contraception. The natural purpose of sexual intercourse was procreation. Anything that interfered with that purpose was considered contrary to natural law. However, immediate opposition to this teaching was voiced by some Catholic bishops in Canada, who collectively issued a document in response called the Winnipeg Statement, which they argued that Catholics who genuinely felt unable to follow the Pope's instructions could follow their own consciences where necessary in making ethical decisions. More recently, towards the end of 2010, Pope Benedict has stated that the use of condoms may be permissible in certain circumstances to prevent the spread of STDs, especially HIV. Now, Protestants on contraception have a slightly different perspective since they don't follow natural moral law. Since the Lambeth Palace of 1930 said all forms of contraception are permissible in the light of Christian teaching. And so this conference suggested it was the attitude was very much softened and towards prudent family planning, perhaps to limit the family size is permitted. It's a matter of loving your neighbour as you love yourself, and as a matter of conscience. Many Protestants may still be opposed to the use of abortifacient, though. That phrase, in the light of Christian principles. With Catholics, they would be against abortifacient because life begins at conception, they would believe. Therefore, any intrauterine device, any form of the chemical RU486 in form of any emergency contraception or any combined pill, all of these are prohibited for conservative Protestants, and they do not kill biblical divine command theory ethic, as well as for Catholics because of the first precept of preserving life. Well, now holds that the use of contraception may be acceptable. Well, the Eastern Orthodox Church, traditionally opposed to contraception, now holds that the use of contraception may be acceptable under circumstances with the blessing of a, for example, spiritual leader. Many Christians in general would still regard the use of contraception outside marriage as unacceptable, as it may be encouraging promiscuous sexual behavior. So on then to some critical perspectives. First of all, Jack Dominion, we can see him in the picture, right? Jack Dominion was a Roman Catholic theologian who championed a rethink on Christian sexual ethics. At the same time, he fought to uphold the institution of marriage. He argues basically that the purpose, the nature of sex should be not biological, i.e. procreation, but personal, i.e. unitive. He talks about we make love to a person, not to a body. And he talks about the presence of, if in the presence of a genuine love between two people, whether they're married or not, That's what validates sex, making it an activity worthy of celebration. That sex, in this context, is healing and even therapeutic. Sexual pleasure, he wrote, must not be trivialized in the eyes of the church, being one of the gifts of God to man, which can become the springs of joy, pleasure, and loving communication. He went on to extend the same argument in defense of love between same-sex couples. Think of sex solely in terms of procreation, he wrote in the New Internationalist in 1986, was deny its capacity to give life in more than a biological sense. Its role in strengthening a couple's sexual identity and their sense of commitment to each other. So if we think just about his points here, when he says men and women in sexual relationship being primarily directed at forming a community of life, which is permanent and exclusive, and when he says the image of God is expressed fully in both male and female, the basic gender division and complementarity of humanity, well, does he avoid all the issues, all of the problems, or is he still, what you might say, heteronormative, inconsistent in his ethic, in wanting to make marriage about male and female? Well, there's no doubt his view is a radical ethic for a Catholic in any case, and not all Catholics, certainly not the popes, have followed his teaching. Peter Vardy is an interesting A-level commentator. He's written the book The Puzzle of Sex, The Puzzle of God, lots of good A-level books you should be reading. His critical perspective is one that is interesting. He is critical of the way sexuality is now transactional. Love only lasts as long as the needs are met, seeing this as a utilitarian approach to relationships, which lasts only as long as the pleasure outweighs the pain. And this is detrimental, he thinks. What it does is that the link between love and sex and marriage is cancelled, it's broken. This transactional, utilitarian view of sexuality, i.e., all about consenting adults approach, undermines the basis of true sex in loving relationships and the stability and social cohesion that creates. Contraception, he argues radically, hasn't liberated women, but actually has encouraged a new form of slavery and male domination, undermining loving relationships. It leads to rape, paedophilia, masturbation outside the context of love, internet sex, and on one-night stands. Does he have a point? You should think about what he's saying. In some, he talks about the commodification of sex, meaning the gods of sex, the Greek gods, Aphrodite and so on, have returned, an allusion to historical fertility cults of paganism, where temple prostitution and sex was the norm. Have a look at Greek pottery if you don't get it. So thinking about both Jack Dominion and Peter Vardy, who are trying to rethink Christian sexual ethics for the modern world, just are they successful? Some would say they ignore feminist or non-Western viewpoints. Many make claims that can be contested, i.e. casual sex is psychologically damaging. The modern world has moved on. Christian view of sex is no longer relevant, perhaps. Is marriage love any more than a social construct which reflect the economic needs of the time? So on to Islamic ideas, Islamic attitude to sex in and out of marriage as an alternative perspective. Well, Islam just doesn't approve of sex outside of marriage in any form. Adultery is forbidden and seen as a serious offense. Sex is a gift from Allah, and within marriage it's seen as natural and to be enjoyed. It's another aspect of our physical humanity. Marriage is important to help Islam grow, and marriage is seen as a foundation for society to function. Now, against this, any culture or society that suppresses sexual expression is likely to suppress other personal freedoms as well. Is a society that is sexually free more or less fulfilled than one that's repressed? Well, that's a good question. Muslim apologists, Dawah thinkers are often make this point that Western liberal societies are not free. Women in Western society are not free, not fulfilled, and just as oppressed. So, what do you think about the Islamic perspective? Does the lack of respect for sexuality regarding marriage can lead to breakdown within and this society, as Muslims argue? Do you agree? Do sexual relations reflect society or affect society to the degree that Muslims argue? Okay, lastly, then, we've mentioned this already, the Song of Solomon. You may want to turn away now as we look at some of the quotes from what might be erotic literature in the Bible. Let's look at some quotes from the text. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love for me was more delightful than wine. That's chapter 1, verse 2. Or, I said, I will climb the palm tree, I will hold of its fruit. May your breasts like clusters of grapes of the vine, the fragrance of your breath like apples. And it has to be said, the Song of Solomon is beautiful language. It describes the woman as a garden, and with all these tender metaphors that are very fruity. And this is really interesting if you contrast this with, for example, this phrase by this rather vulgar fella who talks about in the Old Testament plowing a field. Well, here, this is a garden to be carefully and gently and tenderly cared for, as opposed to field to be. That was Samson who talks about sex as plowing a field, this masculine, misogynist language, as opposed to this, which is gentle and this image of a garden that's a walled garden, and elsewhere it describes it needs protection. Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, is a book in the Old Testament of the Bible. It uses metaphor of two lovers who describe the relationship that God has with the people in the land of Israel. It's the proper context. Early Hebrew and Christian scholars long maintained that this love story is an allegory of God's love for humankind, or the intensity of divine love within the human heart. However, it's undeniable that the song celebrates not only human love, but also the sensuous and mystical quality of erotic desire. And it doesn't differentiate clearly between married and unmarried. Conservatives will say this is about married love, and liberals will say it's about unmarried love. Well, which is it? Here's another extract from the text. Then up early to the vineyard to see if the vine stalks are in bud, if the tendrils unfolding in the pomegranate flower. There I will give my breasts to you. The love apple smells sweet. Every fruit is at our gate, both new and old, dear love, I have laid up for thee. O thou wert given me for brother, suckled at my mother's breast, so that finding you, without I could kiss you, and none make scorn of me thereafter. So just think about this a second. Reading this extract, these texts, what do you think this might tell us about Christian attitudes and ideas, sexual ethics, and marriage and love? What do you do with this? So in summary then, our look at marriage includes so many questions. Is marriage out of date? So many people are childless now. They are interested in marriages that are without children for financial reasons. We just don't see it as a lifestyle choice. Maybe marriage itself is a lifestyle choice out of kilter with the way the world is. Is marriage a form of salvation, a sacrament, as Catholics say, or is it in some ways sacred, as Protestants say, a solemn vow that God will hold us accountable to? What do you think of the various religious and perhaps non-religious views of marriage? What is it? Can it be reduced to? What can sex be reduced to? Is promiscuity outside of marriage or before marriage or ever a good thing, or is it always wrong? What about cohabitation? Can committed sexual love be a good thing outside of the confines and the limitations of marriage? What about contraception? Is that something that has helped women or not, as some argue? as Peter Vardy argues. So what about the religious approach to sexual ethics do you find interesting, challenging? Particularly, what about Jack Dominion's approach, his liberal Catholic, we make love to a person, not a body, that sex should be about unification as much as procreation? What do you think? We've mentioned briefly the Old and New Testament approach to sexual ethics again. Is it coherent? Is it consistent? If followed, or just not followed, and inconsistent or contradictory? What do you think? What do you think about Peter Vardy or Jack Dominion? Do you agree with them or not? And what's your view of Islam's approach to sexual ethics? And what's your take on the Song of Solomon? So this has been video 2 of 7 on sexual ethics revision.